That was excellent. We have a series of questions, but I wanted to throw out a couple of my own to kind of start things off real fast. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the relationship that Tejanos had with the rest of Mexico by the time you get to the 1820s, kind of where they see themselves when Mexico becomes independent. Where do they see themselves in this broad new experiment? And how does that, over the 1820s and early 1830s, what's their relationship with Saltillo and Mexico City and Monterrey in particular?
Stepchildren. Tejanos there was only 5,000 Tejanos in Texas for 100 years. And they defended the northern frontier of New Spain by themselves against the French, against Native American hostile tribes, against Anglo-American, how many, Andrew, in Texas history, how many American filibuster armies invaded Texas between what, 1819 and 1826?
But yeah, James Long comes two different times before he finally gets
Tejanos were the only ones defending all of northern Mexico. And so they just felt, is anybody going to help us up here? And nobody wanted to come up to Texas anymore. That's why I just said 5,000.
Well, did they feel connected? Do they feel like they shared an identity with somebody from, say, Yucatan, for example, or even California?
They did not. They felt really they were alone. They were isolated. They were alone. They were always fighting. Look, the Tejano average lifespan was, for men, 42 years of age. They were always fighting somebody, always at war. And so you couldn't grow the population, and they just felt we're alone. And that's why once they were given ownership of their own land, they said the first thing we want is population. And if it's Anglo-Americans, let them come. We want them. And so that's why they turned against Santa Ana and Mexico so quickly.
Right. So can you talk about that? The relationship between Stephen F. Austin's probably the most prime example, and he spends some time, serious time in San Antonio and building relationships with important Tejano families. But I wondered if you could talk about Austin's relationship with the Tejanos from the Tejano perspective, right? How did the Tejanos see Austin and their relationship both with him and with his colonists?
Tejanos revered Austin as much as Anglo-Texans do today. Now, you know very well that the Anglo-Texans in Austin's lifetime were very ungrateful to him. They were very...
He liked to say that a lot, but yes. He liked to point that out to anybody he could.
Well, yeah. But Tejanos loved him. They really... Stephen F. Austin spoke Spanish. Mm-hmm. And he told the Anglo-Texans, you come to Texas, you're a Mexican. Mm-hmm. You speak... When you talk to me, you talk Spanish. I'm a Mexican. And the Tejanos greatly appreciated what... Now, after about 10 years, 5 or 10 years, the squatters started pouring in, illegal squatters, 20,000 and 20,000 of them, completely overwhelmed even Austin's colony. And so the Tejanos didn't appreciate those Anglo-American illegal immigrants. But Stephen F. Austin, they respected. And I'll tell you something, Tejanos really felt like they were different Mexicans. And we talk about the Anglo-American learning the boots and the saddles and the spurs and the horses and the hat and everything from the Tejanos. Let me tell you one thing that Anglos learned from the Tejanos: brag. Tejanos bragged to the other Mexicans. They said, hey, you guys don't ride horses like a Tejano does. And so they felt that Stephen F. Austin was one of them.
Yeah. It's interesting. You read Austin's letters, and you can see a real warmth and affection between him and people like.
They loved James Bowie, the Tejano governor. The governor's daughter married James Bowie.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it's interesting. I always talk about the Anglo-Tejano alliance that forms during this time period. That both sides get things out of, and figureheads, if you want to call them that, but leaders like Austin and people like him develop these deep relationships that are more than just lip service between these groups. And it's important to understand this period because they ended up depending on each other so much, right?
Yeah, Andrew, I have to point out another aspect of what you're saying, and that is that, we know that the Southerners after the Civil War really felt that they'd lost a lot, and they wanted to secede from the United States because they thought they were not appreciated. Southerners felt, we're the real Americans. You guys up north have given it up. We're the real Americans that are really preserving the American culture and the original goals. And Tejanos felt that way in the Texas Revolution. And so after the Texas Revolution, Tejanos felt very much like, doggone it, they're kind of treating us like we were the enemy. And so it's really important that they felt, and they're as much Texan as the Southerners are Americans today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting to see those analogies between these different eras and movements and experiences, where we can see echoes, right, of different people's experiences played out in similar sort of ways. I want to jump into a couple of questions that people have been posting, and if anyone has ones that are rattling around, please put them up on the chat for us. But one person asked, when you were talking earlier about the Reconquista, did the Spaniards mix with the Moors, and did that have a long-term influence besides language exchange?
I was in Vietnam, and I'll tell you, the first little blue-eyed American was about 9 months after the first Marine landed in Vietnam. Now, you could say whatever you want. Warfare, that's going to happen 9 months after the first invasion, and I don't care what color they are. That happened in Spain. Now, the Spaniards did not admit it. You had to come to the New World, you had to sign that you were pure Roman Catholic and you were pure-blooded Spaniard, and they were not.
Right.
They intermixed with the Muslims, not only culture, but biologically as well. Spaniards started taking up the darker complexion and the brown and the black eyes from the Moors very quickly. They just never admitted it, Andrew.
Humans tend to like other humans.
Well, and it's the same thing that you have in Texas. How long was it before? Well, like I said, Jim Bowie and Ursula Veramendi, right away you start having the marriages.
Well, there's a long history of that in South Texas in particular, right? And these intermarriages that are both economic and social and political, and they tie a lot of Texas history together today. Getting back to what you were talking about the legacy of Spanish Tejano experiences, somebody asked if the modern water laws in Texas trace their roots back to Spanish sources of how we appropriate water rights with rivers and things like that.
The Texas water laws go back to North Africa. The deserts, it's those people who invaded Spain, the Muslims, the Arabs, the Moors. They brought their concept. In the desert, you cannot deny water to anyone. Water in the desert belongs to everyone. And so the Muslims brought that into Spain. The Spaniards adopted the principle that water belongs to everybody. You cannot deny water. And the Spaniards called it the law of the people, the people's right to water. In Spanish, it's called el pueblo, which means the people. Texas water laws today are the Pueblo water rights. All water belongs to all the people. That's why on Saturday, 500 kids will get on inner tubes and go down the Guadalupe River, the San Marcos River, and nobody can say that water belongs to them. Now, they can't get on the river bank. That belongs to the owner, the rancher. But all rivers and the flow of all rivers belongs to all people. And you cannot dam up a river. Austin has dams in Austin, but we must allow the water to flow to Bastrop because Bastrop owns the river as much as we do. We use, and lawyers in Texas have to learn Spanish because we use the Pueblo water laws.
Right. Yeah. And it's again part of the theme of you're talking about the legacy and that we see today of all this history and period and people. We only have a little bit of time, so I want to pop through a couple questions real fast that I can throw a few things at, and I want to wrap up with a particular question for you. Somebody asked, what did the United States do to try to stop immigration into Mexican Texas through Austin? And I can just say real fast, on the U.S. side, nobody tried to stop them officially, but there was a lot of bad press that went into Western newspapers like in Arkansas and Louisiana, trying to spread bad rumors about places like Mexican Texas, because they didn't want people to go, because the people who were going were leaving from Arkansas, Louisiana, places like that. And those states didn't want to lose populations. But there was no formalized effort right there. Somebody asked, were Native American converts in the missions ever commoditized into slavery? The answer is no. Not in the way that African Americans were commoditized in chattel slavery. Were they?
No way.
Was there unfree labor? Absolutely.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, they built the missions. They built the Alamo.
Absolutely, they did all of those things. But it's like this spectrum of unfreedom, right? On one end, you have chattel slavery, and on the other end, you have something much, much different. And
well,
this was somewhere on that spectrum between those two poles.
Yeah, in Mexico, they call it peonage, a peon. A peon was basically unpaid labor. You provided for him, you gave him his room and board and everything. Now, here's what happened with those specific natives in the missions. They were local natives, as well as some of the natives that had been brought up from Mexico. But in San Antonio, specifically in Goliad, those were local bands of natives who were Coahuiltecan, the papaya, the payaya, the venado, and others, bands who lived in the missions. They were not Comanche, they were not Apache. These were the people who'd been here for about 1,000 years. They're the ones, when you see the pictographs of the white shaman over in Pecos, the religious pictographs, that's the culture we're talking about. Now, those people intermarried with the Spaniards and the mestizos of San Antonio. But the interesting thing, Andrew, is they retained a lot of their native indigenous Texas culture. Right now, there are about 2,500 families along Loop 410 South in San Antonio who are direct descendants of the Mission Indians. They're very distinctive from Comanches or Mexican or Spanish mestizos.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. All right, we have time for one last question. Then we're gonna go to the documents. And the last one I'm going to give is, because it's going to dovetail into next week's talk with Greg Cantrell about Anglo colonization. What was the Tejano stance on slavery in Texas?
They had a gut reaction against it because many of them had been peons. And many of them, almost all of them had suffered under the Spaniard, under the colonial system. And so they just had this gut reaction against slavery. However, just like a lot of them had peons, a few of them did have African-American slaves. In Nacogdoches, which was because of the French in Louisiana, right across the border, and a very few in San Antonio, in Béjar. Now, very important in this is, even though very few had slaves, because they absolutely needed the Anglo-American cotton farmer from the South who had slaves and who brought thousands of slaves into Texas and were the source of the prosperity of the cotton industry that they brought with them, the Tejanos rewrote a law to be a subterfuge to the Mexican law that prohibited slavery. The Tejanos, Jose Angel Navarro, wrote a law that said, no slavery, but if an Anglo-American wants to bring an indentured servant for life, he can do it. And so they simply classified the African-American slaves as indentured servant for life. Navarro actually, the Tejanos actually countenanced African-American slavery in Texas.
Yeah, it's a means to an end from their perspective, I think, right? It's they need the prosperity that it can bring because it's not coming anywhere else. Things have been pretty awful for a long
And that was
time.
pointed out in the legislature, and I have to tell you, you're absolutely right. One of the biggest legislators stood up and said, yes, but at what price?
Yeah. Well, and that's the balance they're having in Mexico at the time, because the rest of Mexico is debating, do we have slavery? Do we not have slavery? And so Texas is the one corner where that's profitable and it's developing the region. And so this becomes a difficult position for the Tejanos, right? Because in many ways, the very success of the cotton industry that brings them some measure of stability and economic development also brings in so many Anglos that it becomes a big challenge for them. It's like they start this process that then spins out of their own control by the time you get to the mid and especially after mid 1830s, especially after the Texas Revolution itself.
And you bring up a good point. Texas was as unique in Mexico as it is in the United States, back then and now.
Well, I was gonna say let's wrap up here so we can get